is Audrey Kitagawa, and I will be the moderator today for this G20 Interfaith Forum's Anti-Racism Initiatives webinar on responses to anti-Asian hate crimes. The Anti-Racism Initiative explores the ramifications of racism in historical as well as contemporary contexts and the institutional, systemic, and structural ways in which racism is perpetuated. We express our deepest appreciation to Mr. Cole Durham, the President, and Ms. Catherine Marshall, the Vice President of the G20 Interfaith Forum, for their support of the Anti-Racism Initiative, and all of the dedicated, committed members of this working group to examine racism, its root causes, as well as solutions. In today's webinar, we also seek to inform as well as inspire our audience by examining the proactive ways in which the different arms of government, as well as civil society, are responding to the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes. The Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino, found that hate crimes targeting Asians increased approximately 169% from the first quarter of 2021 across 15 major cities. We will hear from representatives on the federal level, from the White House with President Joseph Biden's Deputy Assistant, Ms. Erica Moritsugu, the federal agencies with Mr. Chinta Ma, the Director of the Office of Communications and Legislative Affairs at the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, federal legislation with Congresswoman Grace Meng, who co-sponsored the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, as well as the state's responses, specifically California, with Assemblymember David Chu, representing the San Francisco 17th District, and Carl Chan, president of the Oakland Chamber of Commerce, a civil society activist and the victim of an anti-Asian hate crime. Our distinguished speakers have dedicated much of their life's work to issues of social and racial justice and empowering communities as well as individuals in ways that advance justice, inclusion, safety, education, and so much more. We begin our webinar with Ms. Erica Moritsugu, who is President Joseph Biden's Deputy Assistant and Asian American and Native, Hawaiian and Pacific Islander Senior Liaison. She supports the President's priorities and engages with communities and its leaders. She has a distinguished career in government services, including the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. She led the Government Relations Advocacy and Community Engagement team at the Anti-Defamation League, a leading anti-hate organization, as well as the National Partnership for Women and Families through the gender equity and race equity lenses. Erica, you have acknowledged that there has been an outpouring of grief and outrage at the horrific violence and xenophobia perpetuated against Asian American communities, and in particular, Asian American women and girls. Can you please share with us about the President's response to the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes and your role in addressing this issue? You now have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, aloha y'all. I appreciate you allowing me to share this space with you today, and thank you to Ms. Kitagawa, the chair of the G20 Interfaith Forum for Anti-Racism Initiatives, for this invitation to speak and to share the administration's view and vision of this work that you're undertaking in a parallel track, but also in harmony with what the government is doing here in the United States. I have to say that I deeply admire the work that you, Ms. Kitagawa, and your working group are doing to examine how overt and systemic racism can be addressed across the entire spectrum of issues being addressed by the G20 Interfaith Forum. So I'm zooming in today from the White House, which sits on the ancestral lands of the Nacotchtank. And I do have to say that it's an honor to serve in a new role that was created, as Ms. Kitagawa had mentioned, at a time of persistent anti-Asian hate and violence, but also during a pandemic that has taken a severe economic, personal, and spiritual toll on the AAN and HPI communities, and all communities. Now, before joining the administration, I had the privilege of leading the community engagement team at the Anti-Defamation League with excellent interreligious professionals and lay leaders, including priests, bishops, rabbis, and imam. And through this work, I didn't just lead, I learned from the deep work that's been done and all that needs to be done going forward between and among all traditionally marginalized communities and religious minorities and religious majorities, to name and honor our differences and unique experiences, for sure. But also, this is my learning, to be sure to name and honor our shared vision of a future with safety, tolerance, belonging, and opportunity for us all. And that experience informs the work that's my honor and responsibility to pursue now in the administration on behalf of the AANN-HPI communities during these very difficult and wrought and hopeful times. And we have the confidence of a president and a vice president who are deeply invested in inclusion and all of the sensitivities to our individual communities and needs that come with that. And they're also committed to providing us with the safety and opportunity that we should expect and can now hope for. So on his first day in office, the president signed an executive order advancing racial equity throughout the federal government. In that executive order, that day one executive order, he acknowledges that it has not been a level playing field for communities of color, that there are entrenched disparities in our laws, public policies, and public and private institutions that have often denied that equal opportunity to many individuals and communities. In his first week in office, in response to that spike in anti-Asian hate and violence, the president acted quickly and resolutely and issued a presidential memorandum condemning racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against AANN-HPI communities. In March, he issued a fact sheet describing further actions his administration has taken to combat hate, and including actions by the Department of Justice, Health and Human Services, and other agencies. And in May, the president signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which was written and introduced and led by our extraordinary Congresswoman from New York, Grace Meng. I'm going to defer to her to speak about her important new law, but do want to take the time to name and honor and thank her for her leadership. I will make one note about the ceremony at the White House with the president when he signed her bill into law. Not only did we have 9 members of Congress present, they represented Southeast Asian, East Asian, Native Hawaiian, and South Asian communities. And we also had honored guests who were from the Buddhist, Hindu, Sikh, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish faiths there too, which speaks to the breadth of the coalition that Representative Meng had built and the power of the faith communities and the unifying commitment to combat hate in our society that bind us together. So under the command of this historic new law, the administration is going to step up. On May 27th, just 7 days after the new law was signed, Attorney General Merrick Garland at the U.S. Department of Justice issued a memorandum about his agency's improved efforts to combat hate crimes and hate incidents. These actions are things like increasing resources and coordination to combat hate crimes and incidents, designating a very senior official to facilitate the expedited review of hate crimes, and to restore the role and priority of the Community Relations Service. These actions will enhance the government's current efforts to combat unlawful acts of hate by improving incident reporting, increasing law enforcement training, and coordination at all levels of government, prioritizing community outreach, and making better use of civil enforcement mechanisms. The president took another important action in May by signing a new executive order advancing equity, justice, and opportunity for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. The executive order reestablished the White House Initiative on AANN-HPIs and delivers on the president's commitment to reinstate and reinvigorate this historic initiative. The new initiative is charged with driving an ambitious whole-of-government agenda to advance equity, justice, and opportunity for AANN-HPI communities, and for the first time explicitly commends the initiative to work on anti-Asian hate and violence and the COVID-19 response, in addition to the many other important priorities that have historically been a part of the work of the initiative. And you should know, in the meantime, that the White House has been having conversations with all segments of the AANN-HPI communities, and this includes our faith leaders and your congregants, and we will work hands in hand with all to find solutions to the problems and challenges that are facing us today. But we'll also find moments of joy and celebration to share with each other. Mahalo nui loa. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today. And with that, I'll turn it back to Ms. Kitagawa.
Thank you so much, Erika. Remaining at the federal level of response, we will next have Ms. Jacinta Ma, who is the Director of the Office of Communications and Legislative Affairs of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Ms. Ma, you have a long history of engagement with the White House in the office of First Lady Michelle Obama and with President Clinton's Initiative on Race. You are also the Deputy Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice with the Harvard Civil Rights Project, and you are also Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office. You indicated that a strong, successful society is built on ensuring that people feel welcome and recognized for their contributions. You further stated that violence, harassment, and discrimination because someone is or is perceived to be of Asian descent must not be tolerated. Governments, leaders, and individuals all have a role to play in addressing anti-Asian violence. We'd like you to share with us the role that your office has in addressing anti-Asian discrimination and practices, and how your own extensive background and passion in combating racism has informed your work.
Thank you so much, Audrey, and thank you to the G20 Interfaith Forum Anti-Racism Initiative for inviting me to participate in this discussion today. I'm really just so honored to be on this panel with AAPI leaders that I admire so much. Before I address what the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has been doing to address anti-Asian hate, I wanted to provide a little bit of context about how anti-Asian bigotry has long been a part of the United States history. So a lot of people have learned in history class the idea of fear of Chinese immigrants in the 1800s, this idea of yellow peril, that Chinese immigrants were evading and going to destroy the country. And all of these things, this fear led to racist laws. But our country's experience with anti-Asian bias goes just well beyond that. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the history of anti-Asian violence, then the racist laws that have limited Asian immigration, and then touch on a host of other discriminatory laws and policies. So many instances of anti-Asian violence have gone unnoticed or unreported, and I'd like to shine a light on a few instances that are notable in the Asian American community, but not really widely known, to show how the tragic deaths of the Asian American women in Georgia it's not an isolated instance. So starting in 1887, we had 31 gold miners who were targeted because they were Chinese, and they were massacred and they were shot to death in Oregon. In 1982, Vincent Chin, who is 28, he was brutally beaten to death while celebrating his bachelor party in Detroit. At that time, the country's car industry was suffering from competition from Japan. And the perpetrators of the murder, they were former auto workers who blamed him for putting them out of work. In 1996, Tianmin Li was murdered while rollerblading on a high school tennis court in Tustin, California. He's a 24-year-old Vietnamese American who is a recent UCLA grad. He was kicked, stomped on, and stabbed more than a dozen times by two white supremacists, and they bragged that they were killing a Jap. And then in 2012, we have Danny Chen, and he was a 19-year-old Army private. He was taunted with racial slurs and assaulted and bullied to the point where he appeared to have taken his own life. And these are just some of the deaths that have occurred, and they show the diversity of the victims. And we know that there are just so many more instances of anti-Asian violence and from a very long history. In 1996, I was working at an Asian American civil rights organization as a legal fellow, and one of my assignments was to issue a report on anti-Asian violence. And we collected hundreds and hundreds of examples of anti-Asian violence, harassment, defacement of property. And so while we've seen an increase in these things happening, it's something that's been occurring for many, many years. So in addition to the outright violence that Asians have experienced, Asians have also been subject to racist immigration laws. Immigration laws in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1917, 1924, all these laws, they barred Chinese, Japanese, and those from most of the Asian countries from immigrating to the US. There were laws that prohibited people from naturalizing, even a 1923 Supreme Court ruling that found people from India, they were not white, and thus they weren't able to naturalize. And then beginning in 1921, immigration laws started quotas based on national origin, skewing immigration towards the Western Hemisphere. And that policy was not ended until 1965, when the national origins quota system was replaced with a family and employment-based visa system. But it still places a 7% cap on immigration from every country. And this is without regard to the size of the population of the country or the desire of immigrants to come to the United States. And this has led to many Filipinos waiting many years, decades, to reunite with family members. Skilled immigrants, primarily from India and China, still waiting very many years to be able to get a green card. And even in addition to these racist immigration laws, Asian Americans have faced other discriminatory laws and policies. Of course, most notably the Japanese American internment, but also things such as not being able to testify in court, attending segregated schools, target laws targeted at practices, practiced by Chinese immigrants, prohibiting Asian immigrants from owning land. And so in this way, our nation's history really shows that both formally and informally, Asians have been painted as foreigners, outsiders, people who can't be trusted or are not willing to integrate or adapt to the US culture and norms. And I think it's really important to understand this history because it makes clear that the combination of foreign policy tensions combined with political leaders who are making it okay to call names or in some instances encouraging violence or not condemning violence, and people not being able to make a distinction among Asian Americans, these things all lead to increases in anti-Asian violence. And so, but what's really great is that there has been so much of a response, a positive response from the media to cover these things, people reporting, people speaking out, and that includes the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission where I work. We're responsible for enforcing federal laws that make it illegal to discriminate against employees or job applicants because of a person's race, color, national origin, religion, sex, age, disability, or genetic information. And this applies to all types of work situations. And so on March 19th, the EEOC passed a bipartisan resolution condemning violence against AAPIs, stating in part, hatred, bigotry, and violence have a devastating impact on workers, and the Commission condemns in the strongest possible terms the recent violence, harassment, and acts of bias against AAPI persons, and reaffirms our commitment to combat racism, xenophobia, harassment, and all other forms of discrimination against AAPI persons and communities, and to ensure equal opportunity, inclusion, and dignity for all throughout the nation's workplace. So in fiscal year 2020, we have received and investigated almost 1,000 charges of discrimination because someone was Asian. And I know that there is a lot more work for the EEOC to do, but we are really dedicated to addressing all instances of discrimination and continue to prioritize outreach and education so employees and employers know about their rights and responsibilities. But we really can't address this discrimination unless people report it. So I really encourage people, if they are facing discrimination, to report it to our agency. I'm looking forward to the rest of today's discussion and we'll be happy to address any questions.
We really appreciated that encapsulation of our history. And of course, there are so many more laws that have been enacted that has really been discriminatory against Asians and other people of color. So in any event, thank you so much for that. And we will be proceeding on to Congresswoman Grace Meng, who is serving her 5th term in the U.S. House of Representatives. She is a co-sponsor of the important COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which was recently signed into law by President Biden. She is the first and only Asian American member of Congress from New York State. Congresswoman Meng, this act, which you co-sponsored, found that as COVID-19 spread, there was a dramatic increase in hate crimes and violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And you indicated that for more than a year, Asian Americans have been fighting 2 viruses, the COVID-19 pandemic and anti-Asian hate. And you further stated that COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act will go a long way towards combating this rise in xenophobia and racist attacks. And can you please inform us about the importance and the reach of this act?
Sure. Thank you so much, Audrey and the G20 Interfaith Forum and all your staff for organizing today's event, an important discussion. And thank you so much for including me here today. I'm thrilled to be on with Erica, who is just such a point and source of pride for our community, representing and conveying our concerns every day in the most important political office in the United States of America. To my colleague, Assemblyman Chu, we've had conversations about this issue over the last year and really want to commend you for your leadership in California as well. To Director Ma and to President Chan, thank you so much for your work as well, and I look forward to working with you in the future. And look, we are all here today. I don't have to talk to you about how painful and traumatic this past year and a half has been for our community across the country. People are still fearful to send their kids to school, to let them go out and play, to let their parents and grandparents go out even to get coffee or groceries. Asian Americans have been spat at, slashed, stomped on, even shot and killed. There have been over 6,600 reported acts of violence. Over 2/3 of them have been reported by women. But we know that so many incidents have gone unreported. And that's one of the reasons that why Senator Mazie Hirono and I put forth this legislation last year, actually, because we knew that most of these incidents weren't getting reported to the federal government in any way or form. And as was mentioned earlier, we need to have more accurate and complete data to make sure that we are holistically addressing this very serious problem and this really essentially what is a public health crisis. I really want to commend the Biden administration, not only for signing a bill that is important to our community, but also to any community who has been victims of bullying and harassment and hate crimes. And I want to commend them because not only have they signed it, they've already started to implement it through President Biden, through the Department of Justice. Attorney General Merrick Garland has already started implementing it in many ways. You know, some of the ways are to designate someone at the Department of Justice to actually review these types of cases, bias incidents and or crimes that have been going on across the country. They have also been working to partner locally to fix problems by working and issuing guidance for the creation of online reporting mechanisms in multiple languages, collecting disaggregated data, and working to expand public education campaigns to empower our local communities. They have been partnering locally in civil and criminal capacity to make sure that we are partnering effectively with the leaders and the entities on the ground so that we will have more people report these cases and that entities are able to more effectively investigate these cases. And ultimately, one of the main purposes of the bill was because you can't mend what you don't measure. And we really want to improve hate crimes reporting by strengthening this infrastructure and oversight to allow for more effective reporting. And so ultimately, we hope that this new law will help strengthen our fight against hate because everyone deserves to live a life free from fear. For too long, the APA community has been largely seen as either invisible and silent or as foreigners and outsiders. So I'm thankful that President Biden took a very public stance from the beginning of his days in office to stand publicly with our community and to call out the shameful anti-Asian hate that has just been on the rise for the last year. So look forward to working with all of you together. The legislation is a very important step, but we all know there's a lot more work ahead of all of us, and I look forward to working with all of you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Grace Meng. And we will now go to the state response to the rise of Asian hate crimes. And specifically, we turn to the state of California to examine its response on the legislative level to the rise in Asian hate crimes. Assemblymember David Chiu represents 500,000 constituents in the 17th Assembly District in San Francisco, California. He is the head of the Asian Pacific Islanders Legislative Caucus. And in February of this year, this caucus denounced the string of violent attacks against Asian Americans, and it proposed new legislation aimed at addressing this growing crisis. Assemblymember Chiu, you indicated that we cannot stand idly by and allow this to continue. Having a centralized statewide approach to tracking hate crimes will make all of our communities in California safer. And you also said in order to recover from and repair the harm to our communities, we need to share our experiences with each other and with those outside of our community. And we'd like you to share with us the scope of the increase in attacks against Asians in the Bay Area that included several elderly Asian individuals, including a man who died from his injuries. We'd also like you to share what legislation has been passed to address this challenge. And we would also like you to talk about the racial bias task force that was created. Thank you.
Well, first of all, good morning, everyone, and I really appreciate the G20 Interfaith Forum for convening us, and it's great to see old friends and fellow colleagues in this fight. Everyone on this call are either folks that I've worked closely with and known for years, or I've known of, and just really appreciate everyone's work during this time period in our different corners. You know, I'll start by saying that for most of the country, when the Atlanta murders occurred, it was a wake-up call about anti-Asian hate. But I think it's clear for all of us that this has been ongoing, not just for the better part of this year, but for the entire history of our communities in the United States. And Audrey, I'm going to correct one thing you said, which was the suggestion that it was a few months ago that our API Legislative Caucus stood and spoke out against this. It actually has been an ongoing speaking out against this since the very beginning of the pandemic. But frankly, it really wasn't until Atlanta that the rest of the country sort of noticed what was happening, and there was really focus and attention on this. I will go back to the very beginning of COVID-19 in the United States before there was a single documented case on the West Coast. As we were getting reports of this virus that was starting to spread around the world, I represent San Francisco's Chinatown, which is the oldest Chinatown in the United States. And we saw in the month of February 2020, so just go back to that time, this was before masks, this was before any shelter-in-place orders, this was before really our country started grappling with and putting into place policies to address COVID-19. We saw in my San Francisco Chinatown a 50% drop in business. And it didn't have to do with anything rational because there had been no documented COVID-19 cases. We realized very quickly that there was going to be racism and discrimination that would come in conjunction with this physical virus, and that the virus of racism was going to be deep. And I know this is something that my friend and an amazing community leader, Carl Chan, saw in Oakland. I'll just mention that I was in touch with close friends of mine who are my Asian counterparts representing New York City's Chinatown. So the Assemblywoman Yulin Yu, who represents New York City's Chinatown, she was also seeing a 50% drop in business. My friend Michelle Wu, who is on the Boston City Council, she was seeing in Boston a similar drop in business. And again, this was all before COVID-19 started. And so what we've seen since then has been nothing short of horrifying. And the Congresswoman laid out some of the statistics that we know. The Stop AAPI hate effort, which started in my city of San Francisco as a collaboration between a number of community and nonprofit leaders, have documented at this moment close to 7,000 incidents of anti-Asian hate, which is horrifying on its own. But we also know from other academics that we know this is a sharp undercount. In fact, the statistics just for California alone, as a fraction of that 7,000 is dramatic, which really reflects the fact that we are focusing our counting efforts very much in California, but we don't have similar efforts around the country. And this is why the Congresswoman's bill is so important, because as she said, if we don't count, if we don't measure, it doesn't exist. If people don't know literally what trees of racism are falling on people and killing people and injuring people in all sorts of ways, we can't address that forest. So this has been an incredibly troubling period of time. But I also want to say, it's not surprising. My good friend Jacinta did a great job of summarizing just the arc of history of how since the earliest days of Chinese immigrant workers being brought here to the United States, to California, they were subjected to anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian violence. And it was actually my state of California that saw the first anti-Chinese, anti-Asian exclusion acts, and we obviously experienced also the Japanese American internment camps in our state, as well as just waves of anti-Asian hate throughout history, and that gets us to where we are today, where we experienced for the previous 4 years before the current presidential administration a president who chose to scapegoat our community, referencing the Chinese virus and Kung flu, emboldening his allies to come out of the woodworks and express racism in all sorts of ways. And so the documented incidents that we're talking about, what gets into the papers are the murders and the extreme violence, but what often doesn't get into the papers are the everyday expressions of hate, the racial epithets, the discrimination, the vandalism, the microaggressions, the picking on kids in the schoolyard. It's incredibly troubling, and obviously we need to grapple with this. I serve in the legislature as the first Asian American to represent Eastern San Francisco, which includes not just Chinatown, but Japantown, our former Manila town, or Little Saigon. We have a record number of Asian electeds in the legislature at this point. There are 15 of us, but the irony is it is during this time period that we are seeing this hate. And so this is why, and I know we'll talk more about this, we have introduced a number of bills this year, including bills to establish a hate crime hotline, to really move forward a significant set of budget priorities and programs to address anti-Asian hate, and really work at both the ongoing incidents, but also try to get at the root causes of why this is happening. This is an ongoing conversation. There is no silver bullet to this, but it's going to require leadership from across the country, in every state, in every sector, in every aspect of civil society for us to grapple with this.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember Chu, for informing us about what you have done, as well as the history behind the Asian communities that you have as constituents. We will now be calling on Mr. Carl Chan, who is the president of the Oakland Chamber of Commerce and of the Oakland Chinatown Chamber of Commerce. And he is the board chair of the Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs of the Greater Oakland chapter. And he is also the chair of the Neighborhood Crime Prevention Council and a community activist. He's deeply engaged with his community and was, in fact, on his way to assist an elderly Asian victim of a hate crime when he himself was attacked. During the attack, racial slurs were screamed at him and he was hit from behind on his head. He did sustain injuries which required medical attention, and he did lose consciousness and is still experiencing some headaches and neck pain. And, Carl, you indicated that you wanted to make sure that everyone understands when things happen to you, that we should be calm, understand how to protect ourselves as much as we can. And you felt that you had to be strong. And you also said that you couldn't allow yourself to be a victim or other people to become victims of hate crimes. So you indicated that this is a reason you have to speak out. And I'd like you to share about your observations of the members of the Asian community in hesitating to step forward to report racial attacks and the steps that you have taken as a community activist to help the members of the Asian community in dealing with this challenge.
So good morning. Once again, thank you for this invitation, especially with so many distinguished panelists together. And I know almost all of you. And I'm so happy, when Erica talked about, what the White House will do, and also Jacinta, and my good friend, David Chiu, he and myself been doing so much work, especially David, passing many of these bills and supporting us. And also recently, we're so excited, when Congresswoman, passing this, author this bill, and the entire community, we are all so excited. But first, I want to say this. Most people don't really understand, what racism or discrimination can hurt the victims and the families, unless you are the receiving end. So I think today is a wonderful topic, especially when Congresswoman talk about the two pandemics. So we want people to understand we are facing two pandemics simultaneously, and the worst part is many people are being attacked, and as you know, those victims, most of them are the elderly, and mostly are women. And so with that said, and people keep asking why and why all this happening, because we have been hearing so much toxic rhetoric demonizing the AAPI community, especially on the former president and the administration. So that has been so frustrating. And with that said, I myself very unfortunate because on my way helping other victims. In fact, I myself have been also along with David, we've been helping many victims of crime, and for the past many years. So of course, many of you realize that actually the question's been asking me, they have been asking, has it been just happening recently? The question is no, it has always been happening for many years. But since last year in January or February, all these numbers has been increased substantially, and the attacks themselves are very serious. And then we all talk about the reported numbers. They were way there's so many cases that has been involved with this hate crime, but only a fraction of these incidents reported. So in our experience, by talking to many victims of crime, I would have to say that will be way less than 20% of these incidents have been reported. And we have talked to many victims of crime and their families, and we ask why. And many of them are indicating that they are afraid to report to the authorities because they feel that they are so worried about the retaliation. And then they also feel that it's so shameful to report, crime. And many, I guess in our culture, they just feel that let's try to just work hard and don't say anything, just move on like the next day. But unfortunately, many of these victims, also with their families, they are impacted so severely, and which many people I've talked to, what they will tell me would be this. They're saying that they are afraid to even walk on their own streets. They are afraid to go out. And in fact, many of their own children or the family members just say that, you know what, since you got attacked, don't do anything, don't say anything, just stay home. And which is so unfair. And we have talked to so many seniors, including people living in Chinatown, whether they're in San Francisco, Oakland, on the East Coast, or any Chinatown they may be. Many of us seniors normally would like to get up in the morning doing Tai Chi exercises. But guess what? They are afraid to go out. And that is just so unfair for many of them. So I think what we need to do, I'm so glad that many of you already have done that because we have organized so many rallies, and you will be there speaking out for all of us. And we are also inviting many victims of crime and the families also to speak out. And the last one that we had, it was on May 15, and it was a national rally. The theme of this rally is called Unity Against Hate. So what we need to do is to not only focusing on the problems, but we want to be focusing more on the solutions, like some of you already offering and something that you have been doing. So what I myself and with many of us together, especially victims of crime and their families, what we would like to see would be some solutions, which whether they are short-term or long-term solutions would be very appropriate and very important. And number one, we want to ask people to help us to do one thing, because we keep talking about see something, see something, say something. But we want people to do this. See something, say something, but do something. I know many of you are doing it already. And that definitely we want to focusing on all this reporting, of incidents. So we are here to encourage people to come out like myself, because I know even I myself, after my attack, many people ask me, you know what, you may be targeted. Maybe you shouldn't say anything. You should stay home and don't do anything. So that's exactly what I would not do. So I'm here to also encourage and asking many of us. I know that we all need support because supports are here and we need to work together. So number one, we need to raise the awareness of what's happening. And we need to speak out. Speaking out is important. But we also want to make sure, I have talked to many victims. They are afraid because they're saying that, would that be justice being served? And many people keep asking and saying that, many people committing crimes, they are very little or sometimes no consequences. So that's the reason why they don't feel by speaking out can help them. So we want to make this change, and we'll make it change fast so that people will feel that there will be justice will be served, and that will be important. But I guess, there are many things we need. We need the support from the family. We need the support from the community. And definitely we need the support from our city, state, county, and federal, especially our federal government. And advocating for many of these victims and also to support their families. But in order to make all these changes, we also need to educate people, understand what racism is all about and the root causes, and how we can, erase all this racism and stop all this discrimination. But of course, one thing we're asking people to do in our rally, in our messaging, we need to make changes. The changes got to be made from the people, because we are also not only citizens, we are taxpayers, and we are doing what we could to build this country. So one thing we all need to do to make this change, by voting. So now that we are encouraging everyone to register and to vote, to exercise our rights, so that we are able to select and finding those who are not just politicians, who are going to be the public servants and serving everyone, and especially currently our AAPI community. So with that said, I want to turn it over to Audrey. And once again, I'm so thankful that you are allowing me to speak not only for myself, but especially speaking for those victims of crime and for their families. So I want to say thank you. Once again, especially many of you are here, the lawmakers who could also help us to make all these changes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl. And, we are going to open the floor up now for conversation as well as further questions, which have been coming in. So anyway, wanted to ask Assemblymember Chu, as the immediate past chair of California's API Legislative Caucus, you really have been a leading voice in championing budget and policy proposals to more comprehensively address hate crimes. And you did mention about, budgetary matters in your conversation with us. And we'd like to hear more about what you can tell us about what has been proposed in this regard.
Certainly. So our API Legislative Caucus in California, we recently proposed a historic investment in our API communities to the tune of over $200 million over the next 3 years. And that conversation is ongoing at this point. What we are proposing that money be spent on is a truly comprehensive short and long-term set of solutions to address this. So let me just describe, first of all, with just immediate direct responses. So from our perspective, obviously we need services for victims of these hate incidents. So that includes legal services, healthcare, mental health services, victim compensation, that is language accessible and really addressing the needs of the diversity of our API communities. Related to that, I mentioned the fact that we have had entire Asian communities and neighborhoods that have been decimated, like Chinatowns and Little Saigons and Little Indias and Manila towns and Koreatowns. And so we have also proposed that there be support for ethnic hubs to make sure that these communities are not decimated. I'll just mention in San Francisco's Chinatown, our major restaurants that have been historic, that have been around for decades, many are on the verge of closing. And we need to make sure that our communities continue to thrive. We also want to make sure that our schools are safe for our API youth. In particular, rethink what happens when there are incidents that occur that may not rise to the level of violence, but let's say a 17-year-old kid calls another kid by a racial epithet. Thinking about what are the appropriate types of restorative justice programs that can allow perpetrators and victims to really be lifted up during this time period, as opposed to either ignoring it or overly punitive reactions that could lead to deeper issues and deeper trauma. Now, on top of that, we are also thinking about longer term solutions and what we need to do. And one of the things we've realized is so much of government and civil society is not accessible because of language barriers. And government in general does a poor job of figuring out how to allow say millions of Californians for whom English is not their first language to access services. So we have a significant language access strategy, and we also have a significant data strategy because we need to be able to track this at a far greater level than we are now. It has to be more than just a couple of nonprofit organizations and Stop API Hate just notching on Excel spreadsheets what happens. So we have issues around data collection as well as really investing in long-term strategies around equity of just how do we lift up communities that have been hit. One last thing I'll mention in our budget is thinking about outreach and just letting community know what help is available. So we are looking to engage with, particularly with ethnic media, another sector of our community that has been severely hit with resources. And I'll just close. I want to just take a moment and thank the federal government, and in particular, President Biden, Vice President Harris, Erica. It has been an incredible sea change in the last couple of months with the responses we are having from our top leadership. And when the president and vice president went to Atlanta, when they have spoken up at the signing ceremony, the meta signals it sends to the rest of society that anti-Asian hate is just not okay, and the federal government is going to devote resources to it. It is just so incredibly important and needed. And I would say on top of that, the fact that the Democrats in Washington, led by our president, has sent federal stimulus dollars to our states has been so helpful. And these are the dollars that we are likely going to have to rely on to pay for some of these programs. And so I just want to give a shout out to our allies in Washington and really for your leadership, for understanding how important at this period of time it is for us to really exert leadership at all levels to address this hate.
Thank you so much, because we really do need to have the practical perspective as well and what budgetary line items and how they can actually improve what is going on within the communities. So I'd like to turn now to Congresswoman Grace Meng. In early 2020, you repeatedly warned the public and elected officials not to blame the Asian American community for the spread of COVID-19 and condemned the rhetoric of those who were stoking and fueling acts of hate. I wanted to ask, how do you see the rhetoric and language contributing to the anti-Asian sentiment that has spiked since the outbreak of the virus?
Sure, thank you for the question. And I think the assemblyman's referenced this issue well also, in that over the last year or year and a half, we had really just been begging the former White House leaders with very large platforms to please stop using terms like Chinese virus and Kung flu, and to just be more responsible with their language. And we knew, we've all been calling this out since last February or March. We knew what this would lead to, and to a worst case type scenario like the tragedies in Atlanta. And so while we know that bias incidents and hate crimes against Asian Americans aren't brand new, and it's not something that started in our history last year, we certainly know that the numbers have skyrocketed over the last year and a half. And that's why we have been pushing for more data, because we know that of the reported cases out there, that many of them have gone unreported and unnoticed. And so definitely the climate over the last year has been really detrimental. And it was especially detrimental during a period of time where our country here Americans were experiencing and going through this pandemic. We didn't have a lot of information in the beginning. People didn't even have guidance to wear a mask, for example. And so there was so much fear, and as has often happened in our American history, Asian Americans were scapegoated out of ignorance and fear. And so, we've been screaming about this for over the last year, and we are just so heartened to see that this new president and the new administration has called out discrimination, on its face, and stood with our community and pledged to continue to work together. So, I'm very thankful for where we are today.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Grace Meng. I'd like to go back to Assemblymember David Chiu, and I'd like you to share more about this hate crimes hotline that was created under your leadership, and why you felt it was important to focus on reporting and the data collection that you had previously indicated, and which Congresswoman Grace Meng also mentioned, and where that bill stands now, and how this fits with the recently passed federal Hate Crimes Reporting Act.
Well, let me first say that we have proposed it as a bill. It is definitely not yet law. It has gone through half of our legislative process, so it's been voted on by the state assembly, but it is now pending in the state Senate. And what the bill calls for would be, for the first time in the state of California, a state of 40 million people, for there to be a 24/7 staffed 1-800 line for people to call in incidents of hate and hate crimes. And what that would allow us to do is really a number of things: to ensure that the victims who call us, the survivors, are addressed with appropriate services that are culturally competent, language accessible, and meeting the real needs of folks who are hurt during this time period. But it also allows us to ensure that there are investigations where appropriate by law enforcement and other authorities of acts of violence and racism and discrimination where they occur. One of the things I'll mention about this bill is this is actually not the first time I introduced the bill. In fact, I first introduced this bill 4 years ago during the first year of the Trump administration. And I introduced it not at the request of the API community, but at the request of various communities of diversity that were starting to see spikes in anti-gay incidents, in anti-immigrant incidents, in incidents against our African American community, our Latinx community, our Muslim community, as well as more broadly our AAPI community. And 4 years ago, when we introduced it, it went partway through our legislative process, but there was a discussion about whether we really needed to invest resources in doing this. And so fast forward 4 years, with the spike of violence, I had some of my Asian colleagues who said, hey, Chu, can we dust off that proposal that failed 4 years ago and see if we can move it forward now because we need it? And what I'll say is, clearly we are moving this forward because of the hate against our Asian communities. But we're also moving it forward because we still continue to see just enormous levels of hate crimes and hate incidents against so many different communities in society today. I mean, just this week, we've seen, and there's been a lot of coverage of anti-Semitic incidents in California, and so on and so on. And it's just so important for all of our communities to realize that if you come after any of us, you're coming after all of us, and this is why we need to do it. I am hopeful that we're going to see some progress on this bill this year, in part because for the first time in our state's history, our governor appointed the first Filipino American to serve as our Attorney General, my former colleague and good friend Rob Bonta, and he's someone who has said from the get-go he really is so committed and has been part of this fight against anti-Asian hate and has the lived experience of this. And this is again why it's so important for there to be leadership that not only talks about it, but has experienced this in a way that community knows we are fighting for them, and we want to put in place programs and monitoring to make that happen. The last quick thing I'll say is, while there are some abilities for folks to call in hate crimes and hate incidents in our state and in our country, we think it's important for there to be the imprimatur of government to say that our government believes that this is important. We want to understand when the incidents occurs, which again is why Congresswoman Meng's legislation to require really all states to think hard about how to do this and to consider resources to make this happen is so important, because we can do this in California, but if there are 49 other states that are not focusing on this, hate will continue, it will fester, and we're going to be right where we started in a few years.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember Chu. And the reason why we're going through in somewhat detail about the solutions created by Assemblymember Chu's work is that, there are so many leaders who are also listening into this broadcast, as well as civil society actors and members of faith communities. And I think it's very important for everyone to be able to hear what proactive steps are actually being taken to address this rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. So thank you so much. And Assemblymember Chu, I know you have to go to take a vote on the floor. So just give us a few parting words that you would like to impress upon us that we can remember from your presentation today.
Well, listen, I would just say that in addition to the 5 of us who are speaking with you today, there are leaders across the country from our community who are striving just as hard in different corners of America to address this. And really appreciate, Audrey, you and the G20 really uplifting this conversation. What's so important for all of us is to be in touch, to share what we're doing, to take advantage of what's happening. When I have the opportunity to call Congresswoman Meng and say, what did you exactly mean by that word? Because that might have an impact on how we think about implementing things in California. It's so important, and being able to both share the good things we're doing, but also be sounding boards on continuing challenges we have is critical. And maybe the last thing I'll say piggybacks on one of my prior comments about just the importance of allyship, the importance of us working together, because today it's our community. Yesterday it was the African American community. Tomorrow it will be another community. And it's so important, if we are going to be supported, to support others. It's also, I just want to take a moment and thank so many folks outside of the API community for stepping to be allies to us at this time, helping to pass federal hate crime legislation, helping to vote on things that we're doing in California, et cetera, et cetera. We are not going to get this. We're not going to get this through by ourselves. And one of the things that I think we learned from history is is when we went through the Chinese Exclusion Act, when we went through the Japanese American internment, others did not speak up as we were trying to speak up. And it's just important for us to model, I think, the type of leadership that we are looking for others to provide during this time, because the anti-Asian hate, by definition, is not being perpetrated from folks from our community. It's being perpetrated by people outside of our community. And for others outside of our community to say this needs to stop, when President Biden says what he says, amazingly impactful. So appreciate everyone's work. Look forward to working with everyone. And I'm so sorry I've got to go vote right now. But as they say, democracy calls.
Well, thank you so much. And we encourage you to be on the floor to cast your vote because, of course, voting is very important. And we, like all of our elected officials, to undertake their responsibility seriously. And we thank you for undertaking your responsibility very seriously and for coming on the program this morning to help to inform and educate and inspire us about the actions being taken under your leadership. So thank you so much. Assemblyman David Chiu. Thank you.
Good to see everyone.
Thank you. So now I'd like to turn to Congresswoman Grace Meng. And, in March, you reintroduced legislation to promote the teaching of Asian Pacific American history in schools across the United States. And to what degree is a lack of education and awareness about the history of Asian Americans contributing to what's been happening with anti-Asian hate?
Sure. Thanks for the question. Asian Americans are often seen as foreigners and outsiders before we are ever seen as American, even if an Asian American has been in this country for 3 generations. And Asian Americans have been in the US, as far back as the mid-1800s. They've fought in wars, including the Civil War. They've helped build the Transcontinental Railroad, contributing to our country's growth and prosperity. But back then, they were also targets of anti-Asian immigration laws. And that part of American history is often missing in our textbooks. Asian Americans continue to be invisible, and the racism that has been faced throughout history are not really fully taught or understood. And so, I don't feel like in our schools and in our textbooks, our students are learning enough about the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese immigrants building the railroad, Japanese incarceration camps. In the same vein, we have not learned enough about the Tulsa Massacre or slaves building the US Capitol, the very place where I work and the heart of our democracy. And so there are huge gaps in our collective history. And if we are serious in the long term about tearing down the walls of biases and discrimination, we need to make sure that our children have a more complete teaching of what our American history truly is. So I'm working on legislation to address this along with my colleagues in the Black and Hispanic Caucus and Native American colleagues as well. To make sure that future generations of leaders have a more complete account of American history, the good and the bad, the achievements, contributions, and the trauma. And in the long run, this might take a few years, but I am also reintroducing my bill, working with our Congressional Asian Caucus to help create a national museum dedicated to APA history.
Thank you so much. And, we'd like to have you also share your very extensive experience working with fellow representatives from various backgrounds in Congress. And of course, it seems as if you also have worked quite closely with Assemblymember Chiu. So based on that and what are some ways we can connect and stand in solidarity with the broader minority communities? And, tell us what else the Asian American community can do.
Well, as hard as this past year and a half has been, I will say that there are a few silver linings. And one of them is I believe that we as a community have come closer together. I believe that we are more unified and are more strategic. And hopefully that continues in the long run. I also believe that we've created and will hopefully continue to see opportunities where we've been able to work with other communities. And yeah, I've been on the phone with Assemblyman Chu and other local legislators from various states as they're working to combat this in their districts and their individual states as well. And I will say that we are living in such a unique moment where so many people from beyond the Asian American community have listened to us, have heard our pain and cries, and have stood very publicly in solidarity with us. I really, to be honest, don't remember ever seeing that or feeling that in this country and, in my entire life here. And so I am so heartened when all this was going on, even early last year, our colleagues from the Black and Hispanic and other caucuses were amongst the first to stand with our community and condemn anti-Asian hate. And it's important to remember that we can create change together, right? Like today, like David said, racism is aimed at our community, but yesterday and tomorrow, it might be a different community. When I was in the state legislature, I passed a law basically requiring counseling for people convicted of hate crimes. And that didn't stem from an anti-Asian hate incident. That stemmed from an incident where a gay man in my borough of Queens, my home county of Queens, was attacked. And so these are examples where we are listening to each other, learning from each other, and making sure that we're being strategic and addressing racism at its roots and not pointing fingers at each other. And some of these conversations are challenging, but I want to make sure that we are being responsible, that we are being constructive in how we contextualize our conversations, especially about race, especially about how we are strengthening coalitions and finding similarities in each other's communities and how we move ahead, how we forge ahead and make progress. And so that requires calling and standing against racism when it affects our community, but also when it affects other communities as well.
Thank you so much. And a final question, because I know you two will have to be jumping off very soon. So the final question would be, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act establishes specific timelines for, among other things, engagement with the Justice Department, issuance of guidelines to law enforcement agencies, and providing grants to state and local governments. And it's only been a few weeks, but can you speak to what progress is being made since President Biden signed the act into law on May 19th?
I'll let Erica fill in the blanks, but as far as I know, the Biden administration and AG Garland has already been very active. There has been a dedicated personnel staff member to review these incidents. There have been partnerships set up, for example, through and with the local U.S. attorneys' offices and the Biden administration to take a closer look at, more effective investigations, public education campaigns, resources for victims, and different aspects like that. So I really want to commend the Biden administration for literally starting. AG Garland was at the bill signing and he got to work right away. So I'm very thankful for that.
So it also sounds as if the different arms of government are working cooperatively together to address this issue, for which we're all very grateful. So thank you so much, Congresswoman Grace Meng. And can you please give us your parting words that you would like us to be able to really remember about your important presentation today?
Well, first of all, Audrey, thank you so much for bringing us together. I admire all these leaders on the panel, but rarely get to be in one space with them. And that's one of the bright lights that has come out of this past year and a half. We are convening more. We are having more discussions. We are having more fruitful and constructive discussions. And that's really what we need to do. Our community has been very vocal and has been fortunate that other communities have joined us as we've called out this violence and ugly discrimination. And let's just make sure that we're continuing this, right? It's June already, which is awesome because we're not just doing this during Asian Heritage Month. We want to be having conversations like this throughout the whole year. And I really hope that we can, and I don't have any magical answers, but I hope that we can make sure that we're not only having these conversations within our own Asian American networks, but also with other communities as well. I think together we can move much quickly and much more effectively as we make progress. And so, I hope that we can continue to work together on strengthening many of those coalitions. And to all the community leaders out there, many of whom don't go noticed, aren't appreciated enough publicly, who are just doing the work on the front lines, protecting our communities every single day. I just really wanted to say a special thank you to all of you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Grace Meng, for taking the time to be with us today and to inform us about the important work that you are and have been undertaking. So thank you so much. And now we will have Erica Moritsugu and Jacinta Ma and Carl Chan with us, and to carry on the balance of our conversation and to answer important questions that the audience really needs to hear incisive answers to. So Erica, on the occasion of the signing of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act into law by President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris noted that racism exists in America, xenophobia exists in America, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, it all exists. And so the work to address injustice wherever it exists remains the work ahead. So we all know that the problem is not exclusive to any ethnic group. The racism is deeply rooted, and I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about how deeply the administration will examine and address the issue of systemic racism.
No, it's an important question, Ms. Kitagawa, and I'm glad that you asked it in the way that you did, kind of through the point of entry of the signing ceremony, which was the occasion of the extraordinary historic work that Congresswoman Meng led to get the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act signed into law. One of the extraordinary things about that signing ceremony and what the room was composed of, when I was kind of seen set before about who was in the signing ceremony and how diverse it was, we also had Black leaders and Latinx leaders and Arab leaders, because there was an amendment to the law that was added in the Senate that was a bill that I'd actually worked on when I was a staffer in the Congress and then in civil society, called the Jabara Hire No Hate Act, which was a broader, deeper in work and longer in train undertaking that was led by the Civil Rights Coalition with the support and leadership of the faith communities, and a bipartisan bill that speaks to hate crimes and hate incidents and the need for data so that we can build better policies to dismantle structural racism and the kind of discrimination that is targeting all of our communities. That was a central part of that bill signing. And in fact, this is a little bit of an aside, and I apologize for that, but we were able to also include the surviving family members of Heather Heyer and Khalil Jabara at the signing ceremony to honor the work that they'd done and led with the most generosity of spirit in their moments and lifetimes of the most grief and trauma that a mom and dad can suffer. But they gave voice to the cause and lifted up their own tragic experiences and their own losses to try to give voice to what should never happen to any other family again. And so I think that that's kind of an emblem of what it was that the Vice President was addressing at the signing ceremony, is the broadening of our vision, our field of vision about the system-wide problems that have persisted for far too long. And as the Congresswoman said, it's not the work of a day to fix, because it wasn't the work of a day to pull us down into this tragic context. I mean, it's the hatred and the racism and the sexism that has persisted, that we've seen targeting our community, is as old as any of our arrival to, or annexation to, or the founding of our nation. And so it's not the work of a day. And that's one of the reasons why President Biden on day one, on his first day in office, which meant that staff were working on it a couple of weeks before his first day in office, signed the racial equity executive order, which is government-wide. The command is to every avenue and nook and cranny in the government to start identifying, measuring, and seeing these symptoms of the sickness that is systemic racism that's actually built into our institutions. And it's not just government, but government is where we can be a first mover in it. It also perpetuated out in private and public spaces elsewhere. And so with this all of government command, you really see their strong commitment. When the president made his first joint address the joint session of Congress, he named this. He named systemic racism, which I believe is the first time a president has ever addressed the Congress with that kind of language and those words. And those words matter because he's naming it, because he sees it and he hears us and he's valuing us broadly as a community and as a part of the broader community. And so I'm very hopeful and again honored with the challenge of helping to implement that EO. Jacinta is going to be my sister and partner in crime in doing this, as is every other avenue at the senior-most level, the junior-most level, and the mid-level of all of government, because that is our president's priority.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Ma, you know, we've discussed the response from government and civil society, and because there are also many people tuning in from the private sector, what can private sector employers do to address anti-Asian hate?
Thanks so much for the question. That's right. I mean, there's so many people out there from the private sector who have a role to play as well. One of the aspects of federal law that the EEOC enforces is against harassment, which is defined as unwelcome conduct that is based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, age, disability, or genetic information. And so this harassment can become unlawful when there's, if it's enduring offensive conduct, if it's severe or pervasive enough to create a work environment that somebody would consider to be intimidating, hostile, or abusive. So, employers have, I think, there's a legal reason not to encourage that kind of conduct, but there's also a business reason as well. So, when we know that racial epithets or, racist symbols are happening in the workplace, these can have a real detrimental impact just from a human aspect, right? So employees will perhaps, will feel a lack of trust, will feel unable to work, distracted, depending on how an employer reacts. They could be really alienated or unhappy. And so when you have harassment in the workplace, it can create, a lack of productivity. And so it really can have a detrimental impact on not only the employees, but also on the employer, and can have a damaging impact on people's, productivity. So it's really important for employers to first have really good policies against discrimination and harassment, and to communicate them. And, this kind of a good policy, it sends a message, it shows how important the issue is. And not only do you have to have a good policy, but really need to put these policies into place and make sure that people are aware of it. And, you need to make sure that it's very clear, when you're dealing with harassment, what the prohibited conduct is, describe the complaint process and the avenues for complaint. And then when a complaint happens, to really make sure that the process provides a prompt, thorough, and impartial investigation. And employers need to assure employees that they're going to protect confidentiality and they won't retaliate, but they will take immediate and corrective action. And it's really important that there be understanding, buy-in, and messaging from the top. You can't can't stress the importance of a policy enough unless it comes from the top leadership. And then there also needs to be a culture of openness to communication. People just shouldn't fear communication will hurt their careers or lead to retaliation. And just really trying to cultivate that empathy, that we understand what people are saying, hearing them, and that they shouldn't be afraid to report, because we can't address things if they're not being reported. And employers really need to recognize that this is hard work. I mean, it's hard to talk about discrimination and racism, and it's hard to talk about misunderstandings. A lot of times these things make people feel very uncomfortable. But it's really good for workplaces. And, not only is it good for a workplace, productivity-wise, it also helps to create a better environment for society generally, right? Because people are, experiencing things in the workplace. What they experience in the workplace, they take outside of the workplace as well. And so to the extent that employers can help be part of the solution to create respectful workplaces, where people are not being discriminated against, where they can reach their full potential, it's really important that they be partners in this work and to really think about it in all aspects of the employment.
Thank you so much. And Carl, why is it important for you to continue with your advocacy work despite the fact that you suffered, an attack? What keeps you going?
I think it's important for me and also to come out to speak out and encouraging other victims of crime and their families to do the same. Why? Because we don't want to be just called victims. We should be the game changers. We can do a lot to make changes. So those are the things, that's something that we need to do. Now, especially, when we, receiving, information and talking about, this new bill authored by Congresswoman and also signed by President Biden, it was huge as well. So things that we need to do, and that's going back to why we're doing this and what is working. Because, not only that will be the game changers, I think we also need to find solutions. And there are long-term and short-term solutions. Despite many bad things happening in the Asian community, we also have many, many good things happening. Number one, I think we're so connected. The East Coast, the West Coast, we are supporting each other. And not only within the Asian community, but we're also having many supports from all communities. And every time when we're at a rally, we are able to inviting, all the leadership, especially lately, the one that we had, we have the NAACP, and we have so many leadership coming out in supporting of us. So with that said, there are certain solutions that we would like to work with our leadership, in the in city, county, state, and federal governments. So the one thing is working so well is creating this Asian liaison officer, which is a police officer who will be serving in one particular community. In our case, in our Oakland Chinatown. So we are hiring, we have this Asian liaison officer who speaks the language, which will help supporting our community. And we're also having many volunteers. They will patrol our community, and which in fact becoming the national known to everyone that is working so well. And we're also having many different solutions. We are not only to give out whistles, safety alerts. In fact, the safety alerts they are coming from New York, shipping to California. In fact, lately we just reciprocate because air horns work so well as one of the solutions. So we're also shipping some of the air horns to New York City and also different areas. And also there are many, many solutions. Now, we just want making sure that there are resources from our governments, whether the city through federal, but we want to make sure that some of these resources can actually be landing to the ground zero where people would be needing help, especially many Chinatown communities. So those are the solutions. We would like to work with everyone and with our leadership and to make these changes so that we will not be victims, we will be the game changers.
Thank you so much for your parting words and the wonderful solutions that you have just proposed and the important work that you are undertaking as a community organizer. And this has been a time together that has just been full of important information for our listeners to know, as well as the general public. And as we bring this webinar to a close, I'd like to also give Erica, your parting words that you would like to share with our audience.
Thank you. I was hoping to have this chance just to make sure that I name this, and it might be the obvious, but it's the thing that drives me. It's the first principle, is that we can't do this alone. Nobody does this alone. And what you've just reaffirmed for us, Ms. Kitagawa, is that we will never have to be alone, both within the Asian American community, the broader AA and HPI community, our faith-based partners and leaders, but also the broader coalition, other governmental partners, leaders like Carl, deep in community, suffering and leading and being generous with his own experience. We can't do it alone, and we shouldn't, because that's not a good outcome either, and we never have to again. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And Ms. Jacinta Ma, your closing comments for our audience, please.
Well, thank you so much for this really inspiring panel. It's been so great to hear everything that people have been doing and how closely everyone's been collaborating. I think I would just end by saying that everyone deserves to be treated humanely with respect and dignity. And we all have a role to play in encouraging that. Anti-Asian hate in the US should not be tolerated or seen as acceptable behavior in any form. And the EEOC, we stand ready to help to do our part to address discrimination and harassment against AAPIs.
So thank you so much, everyone. And I really wish to extend my deepest appreciation to all of our speakers for taking the time to be with us today, knowing how very, very busy you all are, and to show us the really powerful ways in which our federal, state, and civil society sectors have responded to Asian hate crimes. And may these responses be informative and instructive of how we can all work together, no matter in which country or community we live in, to address the many challenges which we have. And these experiences compel us to dive more deeply into ourselves, to do the ceaseless, fearless self-examination, to see how we must change to become better people and to be part of the solution. And the value of our lives is really measured by how well we have journeyed together to bring about a world we want to see, a world where justice, freedom, human rights, and peace can prevail in upholding and honoring the dignity of all people to be free from fear, discrimination, exclusion, and marginalization. Now, true human security and well-being comes from our capacity to be that expression of compassion, kindness, and caring for each other that really sees the beauty in our diversity, which in its plenitude gives us that ground upon which we can spend lifetimes learning about each other and from each other. And in these moments of having conversation together, my life has been enriched by all of you. And I close our time together with a quote from Khalil Gibran. One day you will ask me, which is more important, my life or yours? I will say mine, and you will walk away, not knowing that you are my life. Thank you all for joining us today, and I bid you all goodbye until we meet again. Thank you, everyone.